Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Bienvenidos a un nuevo espacio de INOS, el tanque de pensamiento que está imaginando el futuro de la salud y la innovación en Colombia. El día de hoy tenemos una conversación muy interesante para hablar específicamente sobre reactivación económica, política pública en salud y propiedad intelectual. Es una conversación muy especial porque el día de hoy nos acompañan varios invitados internacionales. Ya los estaremos presentando a continuación. Especialmente nos acompañan de ITIF, de Geneva Network y nos acompañan de la Universidad de Akron, especialmente del equipo que trabaja el tema de propiedad intelectual en esta universidad. De esta manera quisiera darle una introducción y una bienvenida a Stephen Essel, quien estará arrancando este webinar, especialmente hablando de acceso a la innovación a nivel nacional. Recordemos que este es un webinar específicamente para hablar de estos tres temas para el caso colombiano. So this was like an introduction to Stephen. So Stephen, you can go ahead with the presentation and share your screen. Thank you for accepting this invitation.
Okay, can you see the slides now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Brandon, Carlos, and Enos for the invitation to present today on principles for national innovation success. I'm Stephen Essel. I'm the Vice President for Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITIF. We are a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit science, technology, and economic policy think tank that's been named the best in the world on those topics for the past several years by the University of Pennsylvania Global Go-To Think Tank Index. Our mission is to advocate for policies that drive innovation-based economic growth in countries around the world. So a few years back, my colleague Rob Atkinson and I wrote this book called Innovation Economics: The Race for Global Advantage. And the book argues that the world is not producing as much innovation as is possible or as is needed. And it walks through what policies work best to support innovation at a national level, which countries are doing the best and why, what can we do better? And it asks, do we have the right economics frameworks in place to maximally support global innovation output? And that's important because if you ask economists what they study, they would essentially say scarcity, that economics is fundamentally assessing how societies optimally allocate a scarce set of resources, whether wheat or barley or milk. Ultimately, they study allocative efficiency, right? The market condition whereby resources are allocated in a way that maximizes the net benefit attained through their use and the quantity that's most beneficial to societies produced. But Joseph Schumpeter famously came along in the 1930s in his famous book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, and said what economics really should be studying first is not allocative efficiency, but really it's productive efficiency. How do we get organizations to produce in new ways that maximize economic output? And better yet, how do we get to a kind of adaptive efficiency? As he framed it, traditionally, economics has studied how we optimally allocate a scarce set of things like widgets. But rather the relative question is, how do we produce the widget more efficiently? Or better yet, how do we replace it with something better entirely, right? That's what he called adaptive efficiency. And so this matters because traditionally, neoclassical economists like Alan Blinder, who was the chair of President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors, will tell you things like nothing that economists know about growth gives us a recipe for adding a percentage point or more to a nation's economy on a sustained basis, right? Productivity matters, but it's not a policy issue because we're not going to do anything about it. But Schumpeter and the field of innovation economics he spawned says, no, that's wrong. Rather, the central goal of economic policy should be to intentionally spur greater levels of productivity and innovation in the society. And we need to recognize that markets relying on price signals alone will not always be as effective as smart public-private partnerships in spurring those greater levels of innovation. And so our book argues that policymakers need to focus not on market failures, but rather on systems failures. That's because, for instance, the benefits of innovation spill over well beyond the innovator or the enterprise itself. Yale economist William Nordhaus finds that inventors capture just 4% of the total social gains from their innovations, and the rest spill over to other companies or to society at large. This is why we need R&D tax credits to incent companies to innovate, so they'll do so at societally optimal levels. We have to recognize that short-termism in capital markets stifles risk-taking and innovation, that there's high levels of risk as well as chicken-or-egg challenges that inhibit the development of new technology platforms like smart electric grids. We have to recognize that across nations, innovation is not evenly distributed. So there's a need for place-based economic growth policies. And we have to help companies, especially small ones, adapt proven technologies. And we need to find an appropriate role for government in supporting innovation, right? So the answer is not a laissez-faire approach that leaves it principally to the market, nor is it an ambitious industrial policy that picks specific firms to be national champions in industries like shipbuilding or steel or electronics. No, we need a strong set of innovation policies that support factor conditions like investments in science or skills, and that supports the development and commercialization of broad sets of technologies like artificial intelligence or biotechnology. And so we argue in the book that nations that want to lead at innovation have to get three sides of what we call the innovation triangle right: the business environment, regulatory environment, and kind of the innovation and technology policy environment. This matters because, as Finland's national innovation strategy says, piecemeal policy measures will not suffice in ensuring a nation a pioneering position in innovation activity. So the business environment refers to conditions like high levels of entrepreneurship, strong access to risk and venture capital, a societal willingness to embrace creative destruction, dynamic churn and change, willingness to take risk and experiment, good management skills in enterprises. So you have to cultivate a strong business environment. But you also need a good regulatory environment that includes transparency and the rule of law, protection of property rights, including intellectual property, making it easy to start and close businesses, good pro-competition, regulatory and antitrust policies, flexible labor market policies. And underpinning all that, you need a good innovation and technology policy ecosystem. So this includes a robust funding for research, both federal R&D funding and private enterprise R&D funding, especially for commercially oriented research activities. As I said, need to invest companies to invest in research and development, capital equipment, and workforce training. Good universities, strong not just in liberal arts, but also in engineering. Making it easy to create technologies at universities and transfer them to the private sector. Good STEM education policies. So you have to put all this together. In the book, we argue that some countries get various aspects of the innovation triangle more right than others. Europe has a strong innovation policy environment, for instance, but a very weak regulatory policy environment. America's got a good business environment, but not as strong a regulatory environment. So there's all things we can learn from one another, but this maybe charts a path forward for thinking about a nation's innovation system broadly. As we conclude the book, we say that countries have to get what we call the 8 I's of innovation right. So first, you have to have inspiration, right? Setting ambitious or stretch goals for an economy. Like, could Colombia raise its national productivity by 50% over the next decade, for instance? This takes from John F. Kennedy's, notion of putting a man on the moon and bringing him back home alive, right? So set ambitious goals. Declare intention. Make innovation-based competitiveness a national priority. Seek insight. Learn from the best policies that other countries are implementing and understand how you can adapt these at home. Create good incentives like R&D tax credits, because companies and individuals respond to incentives. Create and maintain strong institutions like Colombia's Patent Office or your drug approval agency, the National Institute of Drug and Food Surveillance. As Alfred North has said, strong institutions are perhaps the most important factor for a nation's innovation capacity. Invest in R&D and skills. Deploy information technology like smart grids or intelligent transportation systems. And lastly, have a focus and respect for intellectual property. And I'll conclude with this set of thoughts, because truly IPRs are vital to innovation. You really can't have innovation without the protection of ideas. And IPRs fundamentally create incentives for domestic innovation. And that's so critical, especially in industries like the life sciences, where the process of creating a new drug is a risky, difficult, time-consuming affair that can take 12 to 14 years and cost over $2 billion. You have to screen as many as 10,000 clinical compounds to get to one new FDA-approved drug. And so strong IPR rights give innovators the confidence that they can undertake this risky, expensive process to invest and try to create new drugs, confident in the ability that they'll be able to capture a share of those gains and profits for themselves if they succeed. There was a wonderful study done by Georgetown professor Mike Ryden called Patent Incentives, Technology Markets, and Public-Private Biomedical Innovation Networks in Brazil. And it tells the wonderful story of this plant called Cordia verbenacea. It's a flowering bush plant found on the northeast coast of Brazil. Fishermen have known for centuries that if you mash up the seeds, that they kind of create a topical analgesic that can cure cuts and bruises. So this has been known for centuries, but nobody ever did anything about it until Brazil joined the World Trade Organization and its TRIPS agreement, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, in 1995. And finally, once there were patent rights for innovative drugs in Brazil, this company called H Laboratories, which previously had been a generic drug maker, actually realized that now they could make the effort to go and isolate the active ingredient in this plant and create a drug from it. And so that's what they did. It's now Achiflan. It's a topical analgesic you often see maybe sprayed on soccer players when they get a knock at games. But the point is, it wasn't until IPRs were created in Brazil that innovators took on this risk to bring a novel drug to market that could have been there for centuries. And it's a good example of how strong intellectual property rights incent innovation. As we talked about, IPRs induce knowledge spillovers that help others to innovate. They've also been shown to boost domestic levels of exports, R&D, and FDI. And this wonderful study from the OECD called Policy Complements to the Strengthening of IPRs in Developing Countries finds a statistically significant association between stronger IPR rights and higher levels of domestic R&D, inbound FDI, and exports, as this data shows. For instance, they find a 1% increase in patent protection leads to a 0.7% increase in domestic R&D. Similar increases for copyrights and trademarks. It's also critical to recognize that foreign sources of technology account for over 90% of productivity growth in most countries. So when developing countries put in strong IPR rights, this gives multinational corporations confidence in the ability to introduce their most advanced technologies in developing countries, knowing they can be protected. And this plays a critical role in fostering the global transfer of technology and knowledge. There's also very strong evidence that strengthening of patent rights is strongly positively associated with increased pharmaceutical imports and drug introductions in developing countries. So this results from a study by Cockburn, Langeau, and Schenkerman called Patents in the Global Diffusion of New Drugs. And they looked at 642 new drug launches in 76 countries from 1983 to 2002. And what they found was that the speed and extent of drug diffusion was strongly associated with countries' patents and price regulation schemes. Ultimately, they found that moving from a regime of no product patents to long product patent terms reduced drug launch lags by over 55%. Very clear. Countries that have stronger IPR rights incentivize companies to introduce the new and most innovative drugs in their countries. So lastly, let me just conclude with some innovation policy recommendations for Colombia. First, develop a clear national innovation and productivity strategy. As ENOS is doing, work really hard to turn Colombia's universities into engines of innovation. Give universities rights to the intellectual property stemming from publicly funded R&D activities. Offer your students and faculty entrepreneurial leave opportunities. Introduce industry university collaborative R&D tax credits. These are tax credits specifically designed to incentivize companies to invest in R&D activities at universities at an accelerated rate. In the United States, we've argued for creating a knowledge tax credit that rolls up tax incentives for companies' investments in R&D, workforce training, and advanced plant and equipment altogether as a way to drive knowledge and innovation. And finally, for Colombia and other developing nations, leverage your country's unique strengths for biomedical innovation. Brazil, for instance, has over 35,000 distinct flora and fauna. Its ecological diversity can become a platform for innovation. Recognize that there are many opportunities to make value-added contributions all throughout the drug development process, such as clinical trials. A lot of countries only think about manufacturing drugs, but that's just about 20% of the value of life sciences. More than 80% is in the R&D and the clinical trial stages. Invest in and incentivize biomedical research. Make sure your nation has an efficient regulatory drug approval process. And finally, set a goal of being a G20 life sciences innovator. And what I mean by that is, with Colombia joining the OECD, it's not just joining a club of rich nations, of rich countries. Rather, it is joining a community of countries that accepts the responsibility to unleash the unique, creative, and innovative talents of its people to produce innovations, including in the life sciences, and which also recognize that to unleash the potential of their people, it requires robust intellectual property rights to do so. So muchas gracias, and thank you very much.
Stephen, muchísimas gracias. Nuevamente agradecemos por esta presentación y sobre todo por estas recomendaciones que se le da al país, a Colombia, para continuar trabajando sobre el acceso a la innovación y por estos principios que se le dan al acceso nacional a la innovación. Con eso quisiera empalmar un poco para darle paso en este momento al profesor Mark Schultz de Geneva Network. Él hace parte de la University of Akron School of Law, hace parte de Geneva, esta red, como les comentaba al principio en la introducción, que es pionera y trabaja muy de cerca los temas de propiedad intelectual y innovación en salud en el mundo. Adelante, profesor.
Here we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for having me. I'm Professor Mark Schultz. I'm the Goodyear Endowed Chair in Intellectual Property Law at the University of Akron School of Law. The University of Akron School of Law has one of the leading intellectual property law programs in the United States, where we educate students to become practicing intellectual property attorneys. And we also work on policy issues globally regarding intellectual property and innovation. I also am a senior fellow with Geneva Network. Geneva Network is a UK-based think tank that focuses on intellectual property, innovation, and trade, and hosts forums like this globally to help educate policymakers, the public, and other experts about the importance of intellectual property and innovation for flourishing economies and individual lives. So today, I'll be talking about how intellectual property plays a really important role in delivering treatments to people. Intellectual property fosters access to medicine. And let's talk about why that is. Okay, so first, I'm going to talk about why intellectual property is important and dispel some myths about intellectual property and the purpose of an intellectual property system. And I'll talk a bit about what the actual empirical research says about some of the theory I'll be providing. So first, let's shift the perspective on intellectual property a little bit. So intellectual property provides an exclusive right to make, use, or sell an invention, including inventions in the life sciences, like drugs. So why do we have IP? Well, some people see the answer to that question as because they have to, because they've signed treaties, perhaps because foreign governments demand it, because multinational companies complain if intellectual property rights aren't protected. And really, I think there are two main misunderstandings about intellectual property. That first, that it mainly exists to stop competition. Second, that emerging economies have to protect IP primarily to satisfy trading partners. And so the first misunderstanding about IP is simply that IP rights are a reward for invention. The IP rights exist to stop others from copying, and without competition, it allows for higher prices and the potential for higher profits, encourage inventors to invent things. And this is a really incomplete view of intellectual property, as I'll explain in the presentation. Another misunderstanding about intellectual property is that the most important reason for emerging economies such as Colombia to have it is because they must, because they've signed agreements like the agreement on trade-related intellectual property rights, known as TRIPS, that Colombia and almost every other country in the world signed in order to become a member of the World Trade Organization. Yes, this is an important treaty obligation, but the reason to have intellectual property isn't just because you're obligated to do so, it's because it's a good policy for the domestic economy. Okay, but the result of this incomplete understanding is it leads to people seeing IP laws as a necessary evil, something that mostly protects foreign businesses, and it's merely a bargaining chip. It's a carrot and stick in a never-ending negotiation with trading partners. In other words, many countries think that they shouldn't increase their intellectual property rights or make them more effective unless they can get something in return. And this way of thinking about IP leads people to fail to understand it as a domestic development policy. when it comes to medicine, it leads to a further temptation. Uh, when you're in a country such as Colombia, Colombia can rightly say that look, the medicines already exist. What Colombia does will have a very small effect on incentives to invent medicines. The medicines exist. Why not just compulsorily license them to get cheaper medicine? That's one misconception I'm going to talk about, one problematic conclusion people draw. Another conclusion people draw is that um, allowing copying will allow industries to catch up, that if you break patents or ignore patents, it'll allow domestic industries to catch up by copying. And the third is that the threat of losing intellectual property rights can make foreign companies invest locally, or perhaps develop the local economy more by giving these local companies a greater chance. All of these are myths and they're problematic. And here's why. Because intellectual property is as much about all the steps that happen after invention, um, all the investments in commercialization and bringing products to people, as it is about rewarding invention. Um, Intellectual properties has a really important role in getting people to work together to manufacture products, market products, and deliver products. And intellectual property is a beneficial product for policy for national development because it encourages people to start companies, to invest in creating new products, and invest in developing supply chains and innovative products to deliver to people. See, invention alone is never enough. Let's take the example of the iPhone, the smartphone. The pieces of technology that were in the first iPhone that came out in 2007 that really created the smartphone industry, those technologies existed for at least a decade, probably about a decade before the smartphone came out. Um, but it's often the case that products created in the workshop or lab aren't ready to sell to people. There are quality issues, there are safety issues, there may be regulatory issues to overcome. And sometimes the company that wins the race and creates the most value isn't the first one into the market. Apple was not the first smartphone, it was just the first smartphone that people actually wanted to use, that people enjoyed using, that was easy to use. Apple invested money in delivering the products to people. It wasn't enough that these technology existed. There had to be further development and investment to create a great product that people wanted to use. Um, and then the product has to get to people. So what this slide represents is a cooler full of vaccines on camelback getting delivered to people who are going to get vaccinated at the end of that supply chain. Um, it illustrates a really important problem that healthcare systems face. It is hard to get products to people, and it's hard work that necessitates an investment in creating a supply chain. The drug existing isn't enough if it sits on a dock or it sits in a foreign country and is not procured and not shipped into a country and then not delivered to its people. And in order to understand this challenge and this investment that's made in getting products to people and how it is supported by intellectual property law, I'm going to take an example a little different from drugs. I want you to think about Coca-Cola. Why do I want you to think about Coca-Cola? Because we can only wish that drugs were as available as Coca-Cola is available. You can find Coca-Cola in nearly every remote village in the world, places with no roads. Coca-Cola manages to deliver its product everywhere. And it's a product we're all familiar with. Sometimes drugs, the delivery process is kind of invisible to us because it's so highly regulated. We get them at a clinic or we get them at a pharmacy or at a hospital. We don't see them sitting, coming off of supply trucks like we do Coca-Cola. So let's just think about Coca-Cola for a second. And don't we wish that everyone had access to drugs like they have access to Coca-Cola? And when we look at Coca-Cola, they're able to deliver things just like those vaccines being delivered on a camel We see Coca-Cola delivered on the back of bicycles, on the back of burros, over mountains and down, unpaved paths. And why? And how does Coca-Cola reach so many people? First of all, Coca-Cola works with local manufacturers and makes an investment in local manufacturing and distribution. Coca-Cola has bottling plants all over the world. Coca-Cola also builds a supply chain. It makes an investment in a supply chain from production to the most remote customer. They find every possible way to deliver it to customers. Coca-Cola makes an investment in marketing. They market in so many different ways to local places. They have signs all over the world everywhere you go, and they pitch in the local language, and they help people understand what their product is. And then they make an investment in regulatory compliance. Every country has different labeling requirements, different things that have to be put on the label. Coca-Cola invests in that. These are a lot of investments. And I hope they remind us all that products don't simply just show up. It takes an investment to develop a supply chain, to get them to people, to tell them what the product is, and to invest in regulatory compliance. And you don't make an investment unless you have security. And what gives a business security to make these investments? Property rights, including intellectual property rights. Coca-Cola would not build a bottling plant if they believed it might be taken away from them the next day, or that the country is the kind of country that would deprive them of all their investments in making this product locally and setting up a supply chain and et cetera. It never happens. The investment never happens and the product never gets to people unless the business has the confidence to make those investments. And so they make an invest. And it's the same with drugs, I'll argue. Drugs are so much more important than Coca-Cola, so much more important, right? But in the end, it requires the same sorts of investments. They're often just much larger. Companies often have to build local distribution or manufacturing. They don't do marketing the same way Coca-Cola does. But in order to get a new drug prescribed, you need to tell hospitals about it. You need to teach doctors about it. You need to teach all of the clinicians how to use the drug, when to use the drug, what it's best used for. And certainly there are a few famous drugs we're all familiar with. We all knew about the COVID vaccines. We all know about things like the exciting things like cures for hepatitis. But what about the cancer drug that's just a little bit better than the cancer drug that's currently being used? A lot of science advances small step by small step, and pharmaceutical companies make an investment in educating doctors about the next generation of drugs. They also make an investment in regulatory compliance. There's no country that simply lets new drugs into their product supply chain without certain regulatory compliance. That is costly too. All these investments need to be made in order to get those drugs to patients. And just like Coca-Cola, but in a much more important way, pharmaceutical companies have to make these investments to get drugs to people. And so we see when we think about it, we need to reframe our understanding of intellectual property. It's not a stop sign, it's not a red light, it's not a toll on a toll road. It's more about encouraging investment to work with other people, to set up local distribution, to set up manufacturing. It's more about those things than it is about stopping competition. It's about encouraging investments. So if a country protects the investment in building a market, businesses will come into a market, they'll share their know-how, they'll engage in technology transfer because they'll work with local partners, they'll teach them how to make a drug, how to use a drug, how to work with patients with a drug. All that work and investment can be done, but companies must believe that they won't promptly lose that market and investment to another. They need security, and intellectual property rights provide the security necessary to make an investment. And so this has an implication. If a country doesn't protect intellectual property rights, they're going to miss out on products because companies will not invest in introducing those new products to a country. And that's true of drugs just as it is with any other product. And taking away an investment in a market raises red flags for all investors. If Colombia chooses to issue compulsory licenses on as many as 20 drugs as is being discussed, I don't think it will just affect the pharmaceutical industry. It is a discouraging signal to all businesses that Colombia is a risky place to make an investment. It's a risky place to set up a factory. It's a risky place to market your product and set up distribution because Colombia doesn't necessarily respect intellectual property rights. So I've made some assertions. Let me just briefly discuss the evidence for these assertions. So Stephen provided some of the studies, and he provided and summarized very well important studies. Let me just review some of this evidence myself. More effective intellectual property protection has been shown in many studies to lead to more imports of key products, things like knowledge-intensive goods, technology, computers, smartphones, and other technology that is IP intensive, including pharmaceuticals, are more likely to be available in countries with effective IP rights. Countries that protect intellectual property rights are likely to see more trade, more foreign direct investment, and importantly, more licensing and technology transfer. We'll discuss this more later on the panel, but what often happens is a government that has a positive view toward foreign direct investment will try to work with foreign companies and say, we'd like to set up a biomanufacturing industry. We'd like to set up new drug production. Will you work with us? Here are some tax incentives. Here are some local companies we'd like you to work with. That positive encouragement is much more likely to lead to local production and innovation because companies are more likely to come in and teach how to make an innovative product if the government has a positive, encouraging view rather than taking away intellectual property through things like compulsory licenses. Economic growth works better with stronger and more effective intellectual property rights. We see better outcomes for startups and countries like India that have improved the efficiency of their patent office, for example, in recent years, have seen hundreds of more startups created per year in the time that they've improved their IP systems. We also see that countries with more effective IP rights see better international partnerships for their smaller companies. When a foreign investor has confidence in an economy's protection of intellectual property rights, they're much more likely to work with small unknown companies rather than just focusing on the big champions in the economy. Now, specifically to our subject matter, and Stephen discussed this to some degree, is that more drugs are available with more effective intellectual property rights. When intellectual property rights are less respected, countries receive fewer drug launches, they receive later drug launches, and it's exactly for the reasons I discussed. If a pharmaceutical company is concerned about the security of its investment in building a market, in setting up distribution, and explaining to doctors and hospitals why and how they should use it, in regulatory compliance, if it's going to spend all the money on those things, it doesn't want to lose its security in its market. It doesn't want to have that investment undermined. So its companies are more cautious in introducing drugs to economies where they have less confidence. Drugs arrive sooner too is another thing that has been shown. The drugs arrive sooner. Their patients have to wait for shorter periods. Moreover, defensive laws are often counterproductive. There's little evidence that local production requirements increase medicines access, and compulsory licensing prices often exceed voluntary prices. There have been many experiences where countries have imposed compulsory licenses, and then the drug produced under compulsory license costs more than the innovator price. Why is that? How does that happen? Well, the innovator has an edge in knowing how to produce the drug and thus can often produce it cheaper. Now, this doesn't happen when there's a voluntary license. When the innovator works with a local company voluntarily, then in a win-win commercial deal, then often the prices are cheaper because the local company is taught how to make the drug efficiently. So to sum things up, intellectual property secures investments in building a market. And those investments in building a market are essential to getting products to people. And perhaps one of the most expensive places to invest in getting products to people is in pharmaceuticals, and it's one of the most essential places. So protecting intellectual property rights is essential to delivering drugs to patients and encouraging access to medicine. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, profesor Mark, por estas apreciaciones, por estos puntos, sobre todo por esta presentación. Y yo creo que es un muy buen abrebocas de lo que vamos a estar conversando a continuación con Juan Carlos Suárez, que hace parte del equipo de INUS, pensador de INUS en propiedad intelectual. Trabaja también con el HobbyX de la Universidad del Bosque, uno de los grandes aliados para estos temas de PI en salud que estamos impulsando desde INOS. Juan Carlos, adelante con el panel. Tendremos unos invitados, tendremos a la profesora Emily Michiko Morris de Geneva Network también, tendremos nuevamente a Stephen Essel de ITIF y nos acompañará nuestro director, el doctor Carlos Felipe Escobar, director de INOS, también en el panel junto a Mark, que se unirá a la conversación. Así que, Juan Carlos, adelante.
Okay. Hello, everybody. In order to introduce the next part of our webinar that consists in an international panel, we're going to talk about IP in the health sector, economic implication, but also specific measures that we're taking in Colombia with regards compulsory license. In that sense, I have the pleasure to introduce our speakers of this panel. We will have from Geneva Network to Emily Michiko and the Professor Mark. We have from ITIF to Stephen Essel again. And finally, we will have the participation from the HobbyX of the University of Bosque to Mr. Carlos Felipe Escobar. So the idea of this panel is to talk from different perspectives, talking about intellectual property with regard to the health and innovation ecosystem, but also trying to connect with the economic implication of the different action and initiatives that usually the countries take in order to limit or to promote the health innovation using IP. So I would like to put some specific key ideas first to start the conversation with our first speaker. So I have to talk that in a country like Colombia, recently we are in a big discussion about some specific change of the regulatory in the health sector with big implications. This kind of possible changes in our regulatory system of health sector aims to strengthen the health system in Colombia, but also the different kind of actors, both the private and public sector, are trying to promote the health innovation. And recently, as a first case in our country, our first authority of the health sector, our Ministry of Health, issued a compulsory license in order to let the possibility to produce some specific products of the health sector using IP protected by patents. So in this context, I want to give the floor to our first speaker, to Mr. Carlos Felipe Escobar, And I want to know your perspective about how the intellectual property is contributing the process of reindustrialization. I want to hear about you the connection between IP and economic perspective in a country like Colombia and also in our region. So please, Carlos Felipe, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan Carlos, and thank you once again to Mark, to Stephen, and to Emily for joining us in today's webinar. And I would definitely like to once again congratulate Mark and Stephen on their presentation. I think it was absolutely eye-opening and clear, and the message for everybody in our audience has been pretty understandable, because talking about IP and on all these issues that they have talked about is not easy. I think it has been one of the things that has been difficult for the industry, for universities, for let's say all those who work for science, technology, and innovation all around the world. And so before addressing directly to the, let's say, IP implication, which I would prefer more Emily, Mark, and Stephen refer to those issues. I would like to Juan Carlos, if it's okay with you, to put a little bit of context of what's happening in Colombia, because traditionally Colombia has been, I would say, a pretty stable country. Not big changes, mostly for the, let's say, our last 50 years, a country that have had steeply, let's say, development curve in terms of the growth of the economy, and in terms of, let's say, improving and strengthening the science, technology, and innovation capabilities and outputs, while also slowly improving healthcare system outcomes. In 2022, we have the arrival of the first leftist government in Colombian history. And I think that this is the first issue that for the conversation, Emily, Mark, and Stephen should be aware and keep in mind, because it has been a, let's say, a really important change in many of the things that we were used about. Yeah. Let's say Colombia was not, let's say, recognized as the best and the more solid IP system in the globe, in Latin America. However, I guess that we have done it for a long time pretty well. Yeah, pretty well. And let's say how the world recognized Colombia as a country in which you can invest. You can find all, let's say, those conditions that Mark and Stephen exposed. Well, those conditions were in place. That's why we have, let's say, good relations in terms of trade. I guess some good access to healthcare innovation in terms as compared with other Latin American countries. The new government, Petro's government, even since the campaign, the election campaign, announced major reforms. And this is not only for healthcare or let's say the focus of science, technology, and innovation, but also for many other sectors like labor. There's a major labor reform in place. There's a major pension reform in place, and some others like education and health. All those reforms have, let's say, the traditional direction of reforms that is used by leftists, and I would say not as in the US, left central governments, but extreme leftist government. It means they move in the direction of make the state bigger, larger, and give more power to the public, create a larger, let's say, institutional public reliance on what the government should do, and let's say less and less role for the private side to satisfy the needs of the population. In healthcare, it has been represented by the moment failed healthcare reform, because it was rejected by the Congress, National Congress, some I guess around a month and a half ago, that was moving toward this direction, make the state the big player in the healthcare system, moving from a model that was based in healthcare insurance with a very important participation of private actors towards a state-controlled healthcare system. It has also the rationality of this healthcare reform. I think we all agree it's okay, yeah, because there are still a lot of challenges in Colombia that needs to be solved from our people, yeah, inequality in access to healthcare services, the quality itself of the healthcare system, the outcomes, and the system, let's say, is not efficient in terms of the use of resources. At the other side, then we have some initiatives related to science, technology, and innovation. They propose that the country should be much more developed in terms of science development and innovation capabilities, and let's say produce more science and more resources. And as related to health, it has been moved and is and organized by, let's say, this trend of mission-oriented innovation policies. The school of Mariana Mazzucato and some other actors, in which the state, let's say, should lead the pace and propose that what should be done by the actors of the healthcare innovation ecosystem. That they have proposed a mission that is called national healthcare sovereignty, and it proposed that, let's say, research, science, research, and technology and innovation should move towards producing more knowledge and more solutions that make the country more self-sufficient in terms of healthcare technologies and resources. That's one issue. Government has already put in place some call for proposals, some initiatives, some resources in order to call the universities, local industry, other actors in order to move on and start doing research, development, and innovation towards this good purpose. I think nobody in the country would be, let's say, against improving what we can do for our people and producing more knowledge, more innovation in healthcare to be able to solve. Second element, mission-oriented innovation policies. Then you have another initiative that is related to what government has called reindustrialization of the country. Different sectors, but also healthcare is one of those sectors that the government is proposing to be reindustrialized. It means making local industry more capable of producing the kind of resources and technology that healthcare would need to move on. And they have started, let's say, to move in trying to invite how we can cooperate between local industry, universities, researchers, research centers, in order to produce a more dynamic local industry and to produce this kind of technology that we would, of course, appreciate to have. And of course, once again, it's a good aim that I would say almost everybody would agree. But then it comes to big questions. The first one, that is not the object of this webinar, is the resources involved to do that, because I guess that everybody knows that doing science, technology, research, and production of healthcare technologies is a very resource intensive intention that unfortunately has not come with the resources we expected it would come. But then the second one, that is I would say the core of our conversation right now with Stephen, Emily, and Mark, is that we start to see some decisions like the compulsory licenses of license of dolutegravir recently decided by the national government, and the probable announcement of the possibility of some others could come after at this one. And that is where our concern start to emerge. And when I say our concern, I mean universities we are starting to move on. We are part as INUS and the Hub IX. We're part of a university, healthcare intensive university that wants to, let's say, move on and be in the conversation with local and international industry. But we are aware that this could affect our intention to be part of these solutions. Second, healthcare entrepreneurs. We have a lot of movement of health tech companies, different solutions, hospitals, and of course, national and multinational industry with presence here in Colombia that is starting to get concerned. So that is the context in which I would say this conversation moves, and I would really like to get the insights from Emily, Stephen, and Mark regarding the issue.
Thank you, Carlos Felipe. Okay, after this good explaining of the big picture of the Colombian situation with regards public policies, IP, and health industry, we can move to more specific questions. And in that sense, we want to hear to the professors Emily and Mark. We want to know about the explanation from your perspective of the concept of the compulsory license, but with regard to the implementation in the health sector. How can you describe this interesting figure and how it operates in the health sector, professors?
Emily, you're on mute.
Emily, you're mute.
I had my mic on and then I turned it off. But anyway, I can speak to that. So any country that's thinking about implementing a compulsory license should know exactly what a compulsory license is, but also perhaps more importantly, what it is not, as well as the advantages of using compulsory licensing, but also the disadvantages of using compulsory licensing. So compulsory license is simply a way that's allowed under the TRIPS agreement, Article 1 of the TRIPS agreement, that allows countries or others to force the owners of intellectual property rights to license those intellectual property rights at a reasonable fee to that country or to companies within that country. And all it does is it allows you to basically produce that patented technology yourself. So it is not a way to try to buy patented technologies at lower prices, and it's certainly not a way to accomplish technology transfer. It's simply a way of kind of a stopgap for intellectual property rights, and more importantly, a stopgap for when negotiations over intellectual property rights fail. So under Article 31 of the TRIPS agreement, again, it provides that you can impose compulsory licenses on intellectual property rights, but it does require that you try to negotiate with the intellectual property rights holder first before imposing the compulsory license. There are some exceptions to that general rule. So in cases of emergencies or other kind of urgent situations, but again, it's fairly clear from the way that the compulsory license provisions are written that compulsory licenses really are, again, just a stopgap. They're an exception basically to intellectual property rights. And they're an exception designed basically to overcome transaction costs. So really you should try to negotiate for a license before imposing a compulsory license. And again, because it's a stopgap, compulsory licenses are supposed to be as brief as possible and as limited as possible. But otherwise, the TRIPS agreement in Article 31 doesn't really impose a lot of limitations on what can be compulsorily licensed or the rationales for compulsory license. And so one of the most common areas in which we see countries imposing or trying to impose compulsory licenses is in healthcare. And that's obviously because medicines are so important, because everyone should have a right to healthcare, and because, as both Mark and Stephen mentioned earlier, the development costs for medicines are so high that the prices for medicines often, as a result, are very high. And so obviously this creates some problems for people to be able to access medications. And so it's very tempting for countries to impose compulsory licenses on patents in particular related to medicines to try to produce those medicines themselves and hopefully to do so at a lower cost. But exactly as Mark mentioned and Stephen mentioned, in order to be able to do so, in order to be able to produce a patented invention yourself, you have to have the resources to do it. So not only the financial resources, but also the infrastructure, you need the expertise, you need tacit knowledge, and you need skills. And only the patent comes with the compulsory license, right? The money doesn't come with it. The infrastructure and the manufacturing facilities don't come with it. People with the expertise to practice the patent don't come with it. And so many times, exactly as Mark mentioned, you have countries like Malaysia or Brazil who grant compulsory licenses on patented medicines, but subsequently are unable to produce those medicines themselves, or at least to do so in an efficient and timely manner. And so in the long run, really are not able to help their citizens gain access to these medicines because they're really not, in any practical sense, able to produce those medicines themselves. So this is kind of what the compulsory license is, what it's designed to be, but more importantly, what it's not designed to be.
Thank you, Emily. You have explained it in a very clear way, the content of a compulsory license. And also you talk about the big challenges of the countries when are trying to use this figure. But could you talk about the potential big challenges for a country like Colombia when it's trying to implement this mechanism? Actually, this is the first case, as we talked before. But what kind of challenges our country we can face implementing this mechanism?
Yes. So there are a number of challenges, and as I mentioned, a number of disadvantages from using compulsory licenses, and especially from using them on a regular basis or in a way that's seen as abusive. So one of the things that I mentioned already is you have to have the domestic capacity actually to take advantage of the intellectual property that you've subjected to a compulsory license. But you also need to think about the long-term ramifications of using a compulsory license, especially if you do so in a regular manner. So one of the things that both Mark and Stephen have talked about is the importance of intellectual property rights. And again, a compulsory license is in many ways an exception to an intellectual property right. And if you use it on a regular basis, you can earn a reputation as not protecting intellectual property rights, as not having a strong intellectual property rights system, which in turn may deter inventors or companies from other countries from investing in your country. So as I mentioned, we've seen a number of countries who've kind of succumbed to the temptation of using compulsory licenses for medicines. And as a result, they've created some tension with the pharmaceutical companies who own those patent rights, those intellectual property rights. And so, for example, when Thailand imposed a number of compulsory licenses, pharmaceutical companies said, hey, look, we're no longer going to sell our pharmaceuticals in your country. We're not going to introduce new pharmaceuticals that we've developed into your country. And as a result, rather than increasing access for the Thais to various medicines, they actually ended up decreasing access in many ways. Also, if you're trying to use compulsory licensing, not only to control drug prices, but also to try to achieve some level of technology transfer to help your domestic pharmaceutical industry or whatever industry it is to develop and gain expertise and basically catch up, as the economists refer to it, you can actually have the perverse effect of stultifying that kind of domestic development, because again, you're not going to get more sophisticated companies with more sophisticated technologies to agree to share those technologies with your domestic producers. And so they're not going to benefit from the technology transfer, not only of the intellectual property rights, but also all of those other things that aren't protected under intellectual property rights, like the expertise, the tacit knowledge, the infrastructure, the manufacturing. All these things are incredibly important. And so if you are abusing the compulsory licensing, you can actually deter that kind of foreign direct investment, that kind of sharing. And as a result, you can hurt your domestic industries quite a bit.
Thank you, Emily. You talk about a sensitive perspective because you are describing the disadvantages of the implementing of these figures in a country like Colombia from different points of views. But I want to talk from you and also from the Professor Mark. One more question I'm going to give you to Emily and Professor Mark. We want to know what can be the perception of an IP owners, but also the research and development departments of the big companies, small and medium-sized enterprises that are creating. What could be the perception of this kind of initiatives that consist in the implementation of compulsory license against the freedom to use the IP rights? What is the perception of these kind of actors in the health ecosystem sector?
So, yeah, I can take this. It's as I said during my presentation, it's a warning sign. It's a red flag. It's important to understand that to bring a drug into a country, generally you have to first get regulatory approval. As I said, you educate the hospitals and the doctors on when to prescribe it and how to use it. You set up a distribution chain. Those are all investments. And then if a compulsory license comes in, it essentially gives somebody else the chance to take that market away. So the innovator company has prepared a market, and then somebody else gets the benefit of that investment. Imagine starting a business, and any kind of business, you set it all up, you're ready to get it started, and then somebody else comes in and takes it all away from you, that they get to sell it instead of you. You're not going to do that twice, are you? It's, and companies understand that. And so they become very nervous about working in countries where they don't think their rights are secure. And I want to emphasize, this isn't out of spite. It's not punishment. It's just simple business logic. You don't do business where you're going to lose money, where you're going to have your investments taken away. And in the case of pharmaceuticals, the problem is when a pharmaceutical company chooses not to do business, then the drugs don't get introduced to a country. And so I think that's the big concern. And believe me, every company monitors this very closely. When I practiced law, I worked at the world's largest law firm. One of the things we did was advise businesses on places, countries where they were choosing to do business. They would ask these questions. How well does the country protect intellectual property? They asked about other things like the court system and currency controls and foreign direct investment regulations. But they always wanted to know, whether their investment would be protected. So no business ignores these factors or is ignorant of these factors. This is part of their decision making about whether to do business in a country. And if you make it insecure and unprofitable to do business, they don't come into the country. It's that simple.
Thank you, Mark. And Emily?
So I would second absolutely what Mark just said. So not only will they not introduce new pharmaceuticals into your country, they also won't invest in the distribution, the education, and all the other things that are entailed in effectively introducing pharmaceuticals into any kind of market. And one of the things too that I think sometimes is overlooked is that a lot of these companies who invest in other countries or set up business in other countries, they definitely look at it as kind of a two-way exchange. And so they may invite researchers from a particular country, from Colombia, to come to the United States to study or to learn from other researchers who are working in that particular industry. And so when you lose those kinds of connections with a particular company because you are perceived as not respecting intellectual property rights, a lot of things will suffer, including, the universities that Carlos mentioned, or domestic industry. And so it's something that is a particularly fragile relationship that really can be broken down if you really don't respect the other party with whom you're trying to form this relationship.
Thank you.
Can I explain? Can I say one more thing too? It's important to understand that patents are limited in time. So most drugs go off patent after a short number of years. And every drug that is now available was once a patented drug. But most drugs that are available and are used are not under patent. I've studied the World Health Organization's essential medicines list. That's the list of medicines that the WHO recommends that every country has available to its citizens. And 95% of those drugs are off patent. They're generic. So we're only ever talking about a small amount of drugs for a short number of years that are under patent. And so it's important to recall, we're not talking about all drugs. We're not talking about any drug being protected forever. We're talking about a few years of protection in order for the company to make back its investment and continue to invest in bringing new drugs to people.
Thank you, Mark. I want to connect the comments of Emily and Mark to the next question to Stephen, because you two were talking about some challenges, some implication of the implementation of compulsory license with regards the IP system, the production of new products. But Stephen, we want to hear you talking about the implications of this kind of actions in a country like Colombia when are trying to introduce a compulsory license. This is the first case, but probably we will have in the next months new initiatives or similar initiatives. So we want to know from your perspective, what is the relation between this kind of IP limitation to the access to the innovation in the health system? What is this relationship between IP and the access to health innovation, Stephen? You are muted, Stephen. We can hear you. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. And, to build upon the conversation we were just having on compulsory licenses, I think countries broadly have two choices for how they want to compete in a highly competitive global economy. And that's they can either take an attraction strategy or a compulsion strategy. And if you choose the attraction strategy, you're presenting to global investors a strong environment, strong rule of law, good ecosystem, good infrastructure to be a place to invest in advanced technology industries, whether they're drugs or semiconductors or electric vehicles. Or you can choose a compulsion strategy. Compulsory licenses, mandating that companies produce locally in order to sell to local markets. Well, for nations that choose this compulsory approach, then essentially what you get global investors to do is to put only the bare minimum that's required in that country. You won't do any more than what the government ends up requiring you to do. And so this is really a way for countries to almost exclude and excise themselves from global value chains for the production of advanced technology goods. I've written several reports over the past year looking at like India's or the Dominican Republic's efforts to attract the semiconductor industry. And what is clear is that multinational corporations look at as many as 500 different factors in choosing where to make these, massive semiconductor fabs that cost billions of dollars. And the point I'm trying to make is if a country is putting forward a precarious intellectual property environment, then this is going to have very deleterious downstream effects on the country's ability to attract any type of high-tech investment. So the Colombian government may think it's going to get cheaper drugs if it issues CLs. What it's really going to do is compromise its entire innovation economy if it goes that route. So, with regard to your question about how does intellectual property impact health innovations, the way I like to frame this is to say, and Mark kind of made this point earlier, but access to medicines presupposes the very existence of medicines in the first place. And those medicines do not exist unless intellectual property rights exist to encourage innovators to undertake this expensive, risky process of bringing new technologies, new drugs to the market. So, IP is fundamental to the ability to access any kind of health innovation or drug. I'd also point out, if your viewers are familiar with the Chamber of Commerce's International IP Index, in February, they released the 2023 report. The 12th edition examines 55 countries' IP environments. And what their research finds very clearly is that economies with robust IP regimes experience almost double the level of innovation output as countries that don't. They find that overall, the strength of economies' IP protections goes hand in hand with their overall levels of innovation. And I think it's just very clear that if you have stronger IP rights in a country, you're both encouraging your own domestic innovators to innovate, but you're also encouraging this diffusion and transfer of technology and drugs into your marketplace.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And now I have a question related to the last part that you mentioned. If we think in the future, for example, in a country like Colombia, what are the potential effects in medium and long term of the restriction of the IP system? For example, taking action that conduce to the weakness of the system, the IP system. What kind of potential effects we could wait in the medium and long term with regards the investors, the activity or R&D, the potential generation of new products? What do you think that could be the effects in the medium and long term, Stephen?
Juan, let me add to your question the correlation with what I mentioned starting this panel, and is what would be the effects with these good intentions of strengthening the science, technology, and innovation ecosystem, and being able on producing more science and more innovation here in the country. And then with the other major initiatives in terms of improving and reindustrializing local industry in order to produce more healthcare technology. What would be the effects on those two, let's say, also government initiatives, and the kind of outputs that we should expect, and the kind of, let's say, challenges that a local university, a local industry, and let's say the different actors would face if things go and continue this way?
Well, I guess I'd make a couple observations there. I mean, first, with regard to Colombia's broader innovation economy, the reality is that if a government thinks it can introduce compulsory licenses on drugs to force the disclosure of IP, so in theory it can be more cheaply by other actors, but then a government can introduce a compulsory license on any type of technology. You're already seeing calls at the United Nations for compulsory licenses for kind of clean energy systems, such as solar panels, wind turbines, and electric vehicles. So this is not a concern that is limited to innovators in the life sciences ecosystem in Colombia. This now exerts a potential chilling effect across the entire innovation system of the country if you're an innovator in other fields and you're concerned that the government might decide to take your IP. You know, there was a wonderful article in the New York Times the other day. It was called Au revoir Entrepreneurs. It pointed out that there are 50,000 French individuals who are now pursuing their innovations, their startups in either the United Kingdom or California, because the French entrepreneurial ecosystem is so poor. Lack of venture capital. You know, only until a couple of years ago, the Central Bank of France actually sent out a weekly email with a list of any entrepreneur who failed, right? The point is, if you want to succeed at innovation, you have to address each of those individual factors I spoke about earlier. And everything from, robust levels of risk capital in the country, educating individuals on entrepreneurial and innovative skills. And if any of these aspects are missing, or if they're compromised, like with the potential to steal IP or to take IP, then this really kind of denudes the entire quality of a nation's innovation system. And as was the case with France, talented people, talented entrepreneurs are going to go elsewhere if a nation is not providing a supportive environment for them to try to innovate, and also an environment which gives them some reasonable expectations that their efforts to innovate and to create new products or technologies will, and if they succeed, they can capture, some share of the revenues from those innovations. Now, of course, noting that the vast majority of the gains from innovation spill over to other companies and to the rest of society. But still, of course, innovators we're hopeful that they can capture some share of their profits from innovation. It's also important to note that IPRs incentivize a virtuous cycle of innovation. We see this so clearly in advanced technology industries. If you think about semiconductors, it's the profits from the 10 nanometer semiconductor that allow companies to invest in the 7 nanometer and the 5 and the 3, right? Similarly, in the life sciences, it's companies' ability to earn profits from a generation of cholesterol drugs that gives them the money to invest in trying to cure Alzheimer's disease or pancreatic cancer or come up with solutions to COVID-19. So for nations to have a long-term sustainable innovation system, you have to create this ability for IPRs to create this virtuous cycle of incenting innovation over time.
Thank you, Stephen, for that detailed explanation. I want now to move to a general question to all the speakers before to close the panel and before to give the floor to Carlos Felipe for the final remarks. I want to know from your personal perspective, what kind of recommendations would you give to a country that want to get balance between IP and access to health innovation. What do you recommend? Let's start with Emily.
So this is an eternal question, right? That we've all wrestled with, and that we wrestle with here in the United States and probably every other country. And if I had a good answer to it, I probably would have won the Nobel Prize by now. Part of the problem, I think, is trying to find new ways, basically new technologies for developing healthcare and therapeutics and things like that. As Stephen and Mark have mentioned earlier, part of the problem is that healthcare innovations are so incredibly expensive to develop and test. And in fact, healthcare and pharmaceuticals are the industries in which we think the intellectual property system really works best and actually has a real effect. And it's because of those development costs. And so if we could find a way to reduce those development costs through continued innovation, mostly, we could probably reduce the costs to the consumer, to patients of healthcare, increase access to it as well. I think some part of it too is distribution of wealth. That we have in every country great disparities of wealth and therefore great disparities of access to healthcare. And so I think that's a kind of a systemic issue that each country needs to address in their own particular way, I think, in order to try to remedy those kind of disparities, increase access to healthcare.
Thank you, Emily. Very clear. Mark, what do you think?
So, intellectual property and access to medicine aren't opposed. They're two different things. Intellectual property protects investments, as I've been saying. Delivering medicine, delivering healthcare to individuals is a different set of responsibilities. And so the best way to develop a healthcare system is to not undermine investment in pharmaceuticals or new life sciences technology. Do everything you can to make that secure, to encourage those products to come into your country and to be distributed. And then meanwhile, work on ensuring there are enough doctors, that there are quality healthcare providers available, that there are plans to pay for medicines and other healthcare. We're talking about two different systems. And I think, I've been working on these issues for decades, and I see an unfortunate tendency to look for easy answers. And the easy answers for people sitting in conference rooms in Geneva by that lovely lake in Switzerland, or in government offices, is to say, let's issue compulsory license, let's waive patents. And it's a relatively easy answer, and it's a comfortable answer. But it doesn't deliver healthcare to people. What delivers healthcare to people is getting out in the field, building infrastructure, going to clinics, building clinics, training healthcare providers, going into the most remote parts of a country and ensuring that there's a clinic there. That's hard work. It isn't done in a conference room. It isn't done by passing a law or signing a treaty, but that's what brings healthcare to people, not taking away patent rights.
Thank you, Mark. Very clear. And what do you think, Stephen?
Well, first, I would say that this idea of national health sovereignty, I think, is a very poor idea, almost as bad as the European Union's notion that it's going to have digital sovereignty. Imagine if the global approach to COVID-19 was entirely based on sovereignty. Imagine if we hadn't worked together to develop the IP and then the technology we needed to come up with vaccines and therapeutics to the COVID-19 disease. And then if we didn't share those technologies globally through voluntary licenses, of which Mark has done great work with his colleague Jen Brandt, documented over 500 collaborations to share COVID-19 technologies globally. I'd replace that notion of sovereignty with empowerment, right? And as we've been talking about, the reality is robust IP rights incentivize domestic innovators first and foremost. And a great example of that is a report we released earlier this year with Enos called 2024 LATAM Health Champions. And this compendium profiles 20 wonderful case studies across Latin America, including 7 Colombian companies who are coming up with really innovative breakthrough medical technologies or drugs, things like a company that is going to try to treat cataracts non-surgically by the ability to inject a drug into the eye that dissolves the cataract. A really interesting Colombian company called Kid Smile that develops kind of physical health rehabilitation apparatuses for individuals with cerebral palsy. All kinds of great examples across Latin America. Also, it's not just Latin America. We, if I can briefly share my screen, if I can do that, have been leading an initiative called Innovate for Health, which Mark, you might take a second to introduce. You're on mute, Mark.
Certainly. So Innovate for Health is a series of case studies that talk about how entrepreneurs in developing countries are in emerging economies are working to solve global health problems. And so we look at each innovation in a variety of countries. We've looked at several in Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and other countries in other regions. And what we see is that intellectual property supports the investment necessary to ensure that people create novel solutions. And one of the purposes of Innovate for Health is to show that innovation happens everywhere. A country like Colombia is not a recipient of invention. It's not a country that doesn't invent itself. Colombia invents things. Mexico invents things. Every country invents things. The only differences among countries, they aren't in inventive capacity or creativity. It's in the institutions. How well does the country's government?
Exactly.
Perfect.
That's where I leave my remarks, is to check out our work, medium.com/innovate for health, and recognize that the power of and the ingenuity of your people to create innovations for the benefit of humankind. That's what policymakers need to be focused first and foremost on.
Great. That kind of conclusions, the incentives, and the recognition of the creative potential and inventory potential of a country like Colombia and other Latin American countries. Okay, thank you very much, Emily, Mark, and Stephen, for sharing this deep and specialized knowledge in these topics. Now, and in order to close this panel, I'm going to give the floor to Carlos Felipe to make some final remarks and close our webinar. Carlos Felipe.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. And I cannot not resist the temptation on closing this webinar with a final challenging, I guess, question for Emily, Stephen, and Mark. And it is, you have talked to us in the rational and technical details that, let's say, relates to all these issues of economic development, innovation, success of nations, and how we can make it better. But as you may know, many of the things in politics are emotional and not technical or rational. Yeah. So my question will be focused on how to, let's say, move on the conversation in the emotional way and in the kind of things that could touch a government that has, and I will go back to the misunderstandings that Mark mentioned, and I will put some of them, for example, in the core of the sustainability issues of our healthcare system, it is the cost of healthcare technologies and mostly of healthcare innovation. Yeah. rather than understanding it as an inversion, that an investment that countries that for their health. In the core of our challenges, it's inequality, and that's, if we move against, let's say, a strong intellectual property, we will be able to make the healthcare access more equality and equitative. And then in the core of this discussion is the discussion of IP regulation, privilege multinationals, the big players, and not local industry. That's why we should move on this way. In the core of this emotion is the convincement that it is just an issue that will impact pharma, and pharma is a big. Those pharma companies are big and huge companies, and know that it could has, as Stephen mentioned, let's say, a side effects on other completely different industries, but also on smaller actors of healthcare innovation ecosystem like health techs, hospitals, and universities that are trying to do the best. In the core of these emotional arguments is the perception that, well, we can make it alone, or we should make it with those that relate to us. That is the movement of working this South Center or South-South cooperation, rather than a global mindset of science, technology, and innovation cooperation. So, how would you address this kind of, let's say, misconception that mostly are based in emotional issues that impact the message that policymakers try to make with voters, rather than highly technical arguments that those that you have presented today? I will start with Emily.
So nothing like an easy question to answer, right? So I agree with you, and I actually teach my students this. I think we're in an era globally in which intellectual property rights are viewed with suspicion, that we're not particularly enthusiastic about any type of intellectual property right, and we see lots of criticisms of that generally. And a lot of it does, I think, come from emotion. And I think some part of it comes from ignorance as well. So we don't necessarily do a great job of teaching the public about what intellectual property rights are. I often overhear conversations between people who aren't in the law, who conflate a patent with a copyright with a trademark. They don't really know the distinctions between the three or other types of intellectual property rights. And they don't understand the functions that each serves. But I think also more generally, and I think this is something that I got from Mark, is that instead of constantly being on the defensive foot and trying to explain, why this industry does what it does or why it uses its intellectual property rights in a particular way, that it would be much more productive to be not on the offensive necessarily, but to offer a competing solution, right? So to say, we recognize that there are lots of concerns that people have, like access to medicine, and to try to offer a competing solution that would address those concerns, and not just say, well, we have to do this, we have to use our intellectual property rights this way, even though it may tend to raise prices or may tend to have some effects on access to medicines, at least in the short term. And so I think those are some of the strategies that could be helpful. But of course, addressing emotions and kind of addressing the zeitgeist of any particular era is difficult at best.
Thank you, Emily. Mark?
So I once was going to an intellectual property conference in San Francisco at Berkeley, and I got in a van at the airport, and it was a very long ride. And there was a woman coming back to the U.S. From a long trip abroad, and her job was setting up healthcare systems to distribute HIV drugs to help combat AIDS. And so this was a perfect question for her. I got a perfect chance for me to ask her a question. I said, well, what about intellectual property rights? Do they cause you a problem? Do they increase prices? And she laughed. And she said, this woman was a force of nature. She was an impressive woman. And she said, no, I can get the drugs I need. I can negotiate with drug companies. I get good prices for people in poor countries. She says, the problem is getting the drugs to people. She said, when I went to set up systems in the most remote parts of Botswana, I got to a clinic and I found that the doctors and nurses had all died. And I had to teach the janitor how to administer medication. And she said, then I had to figure out how to ensure that the medications got delivered to these remote places and that they didn't spoil and that they weren't stolen. And she said, drug prices, patents, they aren't part of my life. She said, delivering healthcare to people in the bush, in the most remote parts of a country, that's what I do. And I think that perhaps is one of the answers, is to remind people that healthcare is about taking care of people, about bringing doctors and clinics and medicines to people where they are. And that governments and international organizations and NGOs and drug companies all can work together to ensure that the people most in need who are poor and can't afford drugs can afford them. But we have to get those drugs to people. We have to make sure that they don't sit on the docks and spoil, like as happened with vaccines at times during the pandemic. So we have a responsibility to everybody on this planet to ensure that they have access to health care. And as that woman once told me, patents aren't the problem. Prices aren't the problem. Getting the medicine and treatments to people where they are is the problem. And that's where we need to find the solution and do the hard work.
That's a great story. Stephen?
Yeah. It's one thing for policymakers to take the intellectual property rights of some large, faceless, distant corporation like Big Pharma. I think it's another when they are seeing its effects on real Colombian entrepreneurs and innovators. One of the most cherished traditions in Washington, D.C. is called the fly-in. And this is when representatives of an industry will fly into Washington, D.C. And I was recently with one with robots, where it was we did a briefing to the Senate and had over 75 different robots being developed at American universities there. And so the senators got to, touch the robots and see them operating, right? So, I think putting Colombian life sciences innovators and with a story to tell that IP enables them in front of your policymakers, that's probably the most emotionally resonant way, I think, to try to communicate the message we're trying to make here. Just one other point, and sorry for using a statistic, but I think it's important that policymakers understand this. A researcher named Frank Littenberger up at Columbia found, looking at a 13-year period, that the value of reductions in work loss days and hospital admissions in the United States attributable to pharmaceutical innovation was 3 times larger than the cost of the drugs consumed. When Colombia confronts the reality that poor health and working age adults is going to cost it 7.6% of its GDP by the end of the decade, and we put that against the fact that pharmaceutical innovation has reduced the number of years of potential life lost before age 70 in Colombia by 142,000 years over the past decade, the reality is that these innovations are keeping Colombians and keeping citizens of the world healthy and productive. This is critical for our economic growth. These innovative drugs improve, extend, and save lives. Have to be communicating that message to policymakers. Big Pharma is not the enemy. These companies, from the smallest entrepreneur coming out of your universities to the largest companies, are trying to create solutions for the benefit and health of humankind.
Great closing remarks from the three of you. And we sincerely appreciate these contributions that you're making for our system and the local discussion of these very challenging issues for us. So once again, Emily, Mark, and Stephen, thank you very much for having been here with us today in this webinar. Juan Carlos, once again, thank you for being the moderator of this panel that I guess has a lot of insights for every one of us here in the country. So hoping that these will be elements that we can, let's say, use to improve the kind of decisions that policymakers should be making in the next months in our country. Always keeping in mind that well, building confidence is a very long-term work, but losing it could be fast and very challenges to once again rebuild it. So thanks again for all of you, and we'll for sure will be expecting to have the three of you in other spaces discussing issues as challenges as this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.